Good afternoon, and welcome to the PIL's 60th webinar. My name is Scott Simpson, and I'm very happy to be joined today by my good friend, Trevor Wagner.
Hello, but wait a second, Scott. Before we introduce ourselves, don't you think we should have a bit of wacky banter? We try to keep our webinars fun and energized when we present them for our DHS crowd.
That's a good point, Trevor. Just because we're here with NCMA kicking off GCMS doesn't mean we should change who we are. All right, here it goes. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
It's
Oh, it feels like a setup. It's who?
It's a time to start the show. And we do have a great show for you today.
Maybe even better than the one we put on last time for NCMA. Back in March, we talked about how to drive a new culture of acquisition innovation. We talked with 3 teams, one from the Department of Commerce's USPTO, one from the Department of Interior, and one from FEMA. You can find a recording of that webinar on our DHS PIL YouTube site.
Right. Now, throughout the pandemic, through the last year and a half, we have all had to innovate and iterate, whether it's in our personal lives or in our work lives. In our workspace, maybe we're doing telework and virtual conference calls or, Zoom webinars. And a lot of times with our personal lives, we've been figuring out how to do school and grocery shopping and keep those glasses unfogged when you're behind a mask. The team we're about to talk to helped the Federal Emergency Management Agency to set up and staff community vaccination centers across the United States. In just a minute, we're going to go through all of these. We'll talk about introductions. We'll hear from the team about what they were buying, what innovations they were applying and why to meet their mission. We're going to hear a lot about industry feedback from the folks out there who are in industry and what they had to say. And then we're going to talk about some lessons learned. But before we get to all of that, we like to have someone kick us off. And today we're really honored to have Mr. Bobby McMahon. But let's see some poll results first.
There we go, Scott. I thought you were gonna skip out on me.
No.
Real quick, before we get to Bobby, we wanted to ask what your role is. We do this with a lot of our sessions, and so what we found out is 50% of our crowd are government 1102s, contracting officers or specialists. That's really cool. And then the other 40% are also government. So we got a heavy government audience today. We have a handful of industry folks out there. So we hope to hear your perspectives loud and clear, as this does deal quite a bit with industry collaboration.
Well, welcome to everybody. And now we are very excited to host that fireside chat you've all been waiting for with FEMA's head of contracting activity, Mr. Bobby McMahon.
All right, so we'll let Bobby come on. Scott, let me know when you can see Bobby, and I'll do an introduction. So Bobby McMahon is the head of contracting activity for FEMA, where he is responsible for the management and oversight of acquisitions totaling $1.2 billion and 8,500 transactions annually. Bobby was a former contracting officer, and he's an avid Pittsburgh Steelers fan. So Scott, can you see Bobby? All right. Bobby, first and foremost, will the Steelers make the playoffs?
First of all, Trevor, I have a whole lot more regard for you than that. I cannot believe you asked me such a question. You know the answer to that question is yes. Winning, Trevor, my friend, is what we do. We know nothing else.
That's right. And I think you refer to yourself as Sixburg, so maybe it'll be Sevenburg when the year is over. So
that is exactly correct, my friend. Hey, Trevor, before you start to ask me any questions, before we sort of start our fireside chat, you just give me a moment, please, just to sort of welcome all of those folk who are traditional PIL audience personnel. So welcome to you guys, and also welcome to those persons who are with NCMA. It is absolutely great to have you. And then I got a tad bit of advice, Trevor, for both you and Scott. You guys do an absolutely great job with the PIL, and you guys ought to stay out of the comic business.
We've heard that before, but it's one of those areas we just can't stay away from. Okay. And maybe we'll get some better jokes next time. How about that?
Okay, maybe that'll work.
Hey, Bobby, I do have a few questions for you. So let's just get started. You know, for a mission critical $3 billion procurement, FEMA really chose to lean into the procurement innovation space pretty heavily. Well, what does that say about the temperature of innovation to support the mission at FEMA?
So, very good question. Here's sort of probably how I would start to answer that question. Obviously, you guys know that the mission of DHS in terms of protecting the homeland, and then that mission is sort of spread across the DHS components, is an extremely important mission. And so having said that, most of the time you don't have the opportunity to sort of get ready. You sort of have to be ready. Obviously, there is no one entity across government anywhere that's 100% ready, because obviously the dynamics that affect any situation are fluid. But having said that, I think that the leaders that were here before Paul and Nina, and that is Soraya, did an absolutely great job in terms of a number of the things that she put in place. And now I think that both Nina as well as Paul are doing a great job adding to those things and also sustaining those things. So with regard specifically to that question that you asked, what I would say is that obviously, you know, you have things such as the EDGE program that Soraya put in place. You have things such as the procurement roadmap strategy that she put in place. Then you also have something like the PIL that she put in place. I think that our organization has done a great job in terms of working, Trevor, with folk like yourself, folk like Scott, and all the other persons who come from across industry that represent the PIL to come up with some of those innovative ways in order for us to make sure that we sort of employ some of that ingenuity with regard to what it is that we do. Here's probably a good example of it. I think that you guys know one of the things that FEMA did with regard to responding to this unfortunate COVID situation is that we built a significantly large program relative to vaccination support. I think we awarded, my memory serves me correct, a $3.2 billion program. That $3.2 billion program was separated across 2 contracts. So each contract worth about $1.6 billion. And what those contracts serve to do is to put in place an infrastructure that's going to allow for vaccination capabilities to occur all throughout the country or all throughout the interest of a US interest. And so having said that, I think we employed through the PIL one of our strategies, which was a strategy where we did a advisory down select. And so we did an advisory down select. We got a multitude of offers, and at the end of the day, we ended up with the awards that we needed in order to move the nation forward, and to also put in place capabilities that's going to allow for localities all across the country to provide for facilities for individuals to get vaccinated. And so I just want to stop for one moment. So I'm going to sort of go back to your question with regard to leaning forward. Again, we looked through the PIL. We understand some of the capabilities that the PIL had to offer. One was the advisory down select. Obviously, that PIL concept was put in place by Soraya and Nina, now being led by Paul, and we're able to take advantage of that in order to make sure that we ended up at the end of the day with 2 very, very solid contracts, and we're able to get help to individuals all across the country. And here's probably the last thing that I'd say, Trevor, in response to that question. It's not just a matter of innovation. The PIL is a very, very good thing, but it's just not a matter of innovation. I think some of the forethought that Soraya had when she developed that program was really not necessarily to be innovative, while that's a good thing. It's really in order to make sure that we have the ability to support the American people in their time of need. And so that's really sort of what happened here. And that's sort of one of the things that innovation allows you to do.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. It's all done to support the taxpayer, the mission, and what we do here at DHS. And the good news for everybody out there today is that's the exact topic we're going to dive heavily into in just a little bit. So we're going to learn all about that procurement and those CVCs. Now, from this past fiscal year, our first entire year operating under this new business structure promulgated by this pandemic, do you have any top lessons learned from leading a large workforce, supporting a critical mission while all now remote?
So you ask a good question. I think probably the best lesson that I've learned is probably what I sort of touched on just a moment ago with regard to the first question that you asked, and that is that you can't sort of get ready in the event that something happens, because what you're doing in that context is that you're being reactive as opposed to being proactive. You sort of have to be ready. And again, the dynamics of any situation is always going to change, but you want to be ready as best as possible. So sort of having said that, then what that means to me is that with regard to all the capabilities that you have within your organization, you want to make sure that those capabilities are firing on all cylinders, whether it's your operations division that actually executes the contracts, whether it's your quality assurance organization that actually does the reviews for you, whether it's the organization that actually takes a look at all of the provisions and contract clauses that you're going to be subject to, whether it's the portfolio management organization, the industry liaison personnel. You have to get ready and you have to sort of be ready. Then in addition to that, one of the things that's most important, Trevor, that's associated to that is that you can never, ever leave out industry. Industry is probably one of the key cogs in the wheel that allows for the government to function properly and also to function effectively, because quite frankly, no one entity has the answer to all the questions. You want to come together, not just as a whole of government, but as a whole of capability in order to make things happen. And so what I've learned with regard to this, being able to respond to disasters, whether those disasters are man-made disasters or whether or not those disasters occur based on some nefarious activity. And that is that you have to make sure that you include the entities that's going to help you to come up with solutions. And so that's probably what I've learned most in the face of this, dealing with this COVID over the last year or two.
Yeah, and I hope everybody will hear that as not just a key takeaway from you in your leadership position, but really as one of the key themes to today's session. And that's a really important point. And I think our final question here is going to be really one on something that's vital to this administration, and that's empowerment. So this team tried a lot of new techniques and processes together. And empowering a team is vital when trying anything new. Not just procurement techniques, but really anything new in the process. Can you speak to the importance of empowering a team and how that can affect morale and the outcomes of the team?
So here's the thing, leaders sort of identify strategy and then set the tone for an organization. That's sort of what leaders do. And let me be very, very clear. Leaders don't, if you will, effectively execute the mission of an organization. Those persons that I refer to as operators, those are the ones who actually execute the mission of an organization. And so having said that, you have to make sure that those folk are as sharp as they can possibly be, make sure that they have the tools, the resources that are necessary in order for them to keep that sharpness in place. Then you have to simply allow them to operate. You have to give them the space to operate. And then more importantly, you have to have trust in them. I want to go back, Trevor, to some of the response that I gave you in your initial question. So with regard to this enormous acquisition that we did relative to a vaccination support, one of the things that I stood by and I watched the team do, with quite frankly the help of the PIL and some of the other partners across the government, is that those individuals came up with what I consider to be the right type of IPT. Whenever you hear about these integrated project teams in acquisitions, what you hear about is the contracting staff, the program staff, and then you have a few policy people. That's generally what you hear of whenever you think about an IPT, but that was not the IPT that we put in place. The IPT that we put in place included policy, it included legal personnel, it included CFO personnel, it included IT personnel, it included the business personnel, along with the requirements personnel, program personnel, procurement personnel, and in some instances, it also included us having conversations with industry. Because quite frankly, whenever you're dealing with a situation like the one we're dealing with as associated to COVID, you need all the right people at the table. And so that's one of the things that we did. And that would not have happened without empowerment. And so those individuals were empowered to do that. They did that. They put those programs in place. And one thing that's evident about empowerment today is that those programs work, and those programs would not have worked without those individuals having the confidence to know that the leadership, not across FEMA, not solely across FEMA, but the leadership across the government, because remember, that was a whole of government approach. The leadership across government entrusted them, empowered them, and allowed them to operate.
That's right. And I can't thank you enough for some of those sage words. I mean, you talked about setting the tone for an organization. That's why you're our tone from the top today. So I just want to thank you for taking the time, having not just our government folks at DHS, but across the government and industry to hear some of these really good key takeaways. So, sir, unless you have any final points, I think we're going to turn it back over to the team so they can learn about all of the good things you discussed earlier.
Hey, Trevor, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. And I trust that everyone will have a great remainder of the holiday season.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And I'll say thanks to Bobby too. Really great tone from the top. You talk about setting the stage for everything we're about to talk to. That definitely did it. Now I think it's time to introduce our two other guests. Today we are very happy to be joined by Sharon Edwards. Sharon was the contracting officer for this event. Sharon, say hello.
Hello.
And the other really great person we're going to talk to today is Monique Park. Monique was the project manager for this effort. Monique, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Hello.
So, Monique, in order to fully understand everything, let me see here. Yeah. In order to fully understand what we were buying here, first we need to jump into that time machine. We need to go back to January of 2020. January of 2021. Sorry, I'm already in 20. We were 9 months into the pandemic. The vaccines had just been approved for the government, for public. What was FEMA doing to help roll out those vaccines?
So FEMA was tasked to be the lead coordinating agency to work with other federal departments to support the COVID vaccination campaign. So we collaborated with a whole bunch of agencies to deploy medical personnel to local community vaccination centers. So it entailed thousands of federal employees, doctors and nurses and pharmacists and EMTs being deployed on sometimes numerous times. So their deployment, unfortunately, could not be a long-term solution. So that triggered us to come up with a contract solution that could be more long-term or enduring to continue the vaccination support.
It's a really important mission. You guys were looking at having up to 2,500 personnel deployed per region, east and west, to offer these vaccinations to the public.
Yes, at the height of the federal employee deployment, we had over 6,000 personnel. So that was how the requirement was developed to come up with 2 contracts, each region covering up to 2,500 or overall 5,000 employees or contractors to be potentially deployed to all 50 states, all OCONUS locations, and including the District of Columbia.
Excellent. Really super important mission. Let's give everyone out there in the audience just a sneak peek at how you set up your solicitation. You had 2 phases. In phase 1, you had corporate experience, which was just a short written response. And then in phase 2, you had this hybrid approach where people talked about their staffing and management approach in both written and oral presentation. Now, not to spoil the ending, but you all did this really fast. You did it in just 79 days from when the solicitation was released until when you awarded, using FAR Part 15 procedures. And like Bobby said, you did 2 $1.6 billion with a B IDIQ contracts. Now, when people think about procurement innovations, a lot of times they think of them in a silo. They think about just oral presentations or just confidence ratings. But here, you all combined a lot of different innovations into one really nice, really comprehensive acquisition strategy. You actually used 11 techniques and you right-sized them and used them as appropriate for your solution. And we're going to start to talk through these, but we're not going to talk about them in terms of one or the other. We're going to kind of bunch them together and see which ones fit nicely. So we're actually going to start with collaboration. Sharon, once Monique identified the requirement that we talked about just a second ago, she prepared the package and she sent it over to you. She was working as fast as she possibly could to help the American public. What did you think of the package she sent over?
Well, Scott, I'll say this, receiving a complete package is really important in the acquisition community because we don't get that all the time. And I think Monique's prior experience being a contracting officer helped her put that package together. I mean, it was a perfect package at the perfect time. And so everything from the acquisition plan to the source selection plan to she even sent over the evaluation factors. Appendix G was already put together. I just had to get it signed by the COCO. I mean, every document was in place for me to just take that package and actually move forward with it. So receiving a package, a complete package is really important. I mean, I got that package and I was like, wow, this is great. I mean, and so hats off to Monique for putting that together. She spent a lot of time getting that together. And so I was able to just, as a CEO, just take it and run with it.
And while you were preparing that solicitation, you didn't get just collaborate with Monique, you collaborated with a lot of people, and it was almost right from the beginning. So how did that collaboration impact the process as you were moving through it?
Okay, so I mean, it was definitely a team effort. And so I had legal on my side. I had 2 legal advisors that were able to review the solicitation. We, in putting the solicitation together, we had collaboration with HHS, the VA, just on, because this is something that we've never bought before. And so we had to kind of teach ourselves on what to actually look for, what to ask the contractors for, what did credentialing mean? So we didn't know any of that. So HHS helped us out with a statement of work on a similar contract that they had. So we were able to take that statement of work and make it our own. They helped us out with some what to look for from the contractors, what some acronyms meant. So the collaboration with HHS and the VA gave us a heads up on some contracts that they had written that were similar, what to look for. So that collaboration with other agencies was very helpful in constructing our own solicitation.
Yeah, I think that cross-agency collaboration is
Yes.
So many times people talk about, oh, you know, DHS did this and didn't talk to anyone else. Well, that was not the case here. We collaborated, you all collaborated with almost everybody. Monique, what was the collaboration like for you? We mentioned HHS and Public Health Services. What'd you think?
It was great. So FEMA has done a lot of things to provide disaster support, but providing medical staffing of this magnitude, we have never done it. So we were kind of coming in green with what it means to recruit and deploy thousands of medical staffing. So we definitely had to consult the experts at HHS, even DOD on their aspect of what it's like to simultaneously deploy thousands of people across the country. The Veterans Administration, they also have a similar type of requirement. So we got to consult them, and they really helped us with the drafting of the statement of work and defining the medical staffing qualification and GSA as well, because they already have a schedule with a lot of the medical staffing. But not only just to fit other federal entities, we also got to collaborate with and consult professional associations, just like American Nurses Association. Also, I want to mention that we had 2 experts, one from DOD, another person from HHS, who were part of the technical evaluation board as non-voting advisors, and their support really helped out for them to tell us about the medical jargon or maybe staffing or logistical jargons.
And I think that's just amazing. Not only did you trust these agencies enough to reach out and collaborate with them on your requirements, but you trusted them enough to invite them into the evaluation. That's like the sacred ground for a lot of CEOs and a lot of agencies where they kind of draw the lines. But here, all those lines were gone because you all knew that this was such an important mission that you couldn't waste time on fighting over, ground and everything else. Now, we heard Bobby talk earlier about collaboration with industry and how important that was. Sharon, why don't you tell us what kind of other collaboration you did with industry here? But you're on mute, Sharon.
Bound to happen today.
There we go. I will say, Scott, Scott, the majority of our collaboration was with other agencies that had actually done this type of requirement. But the other thing that we did is we put a draft solicitation out. And so that draft solicitation was helpful in getting the industry prepared for bidding on the actual requirement. So we put it out about 2 weeks before, and it gave time for industry to get their SAM.gov registration done. It gave them time to register as joint ventures, any type of teaming arrangements, partners. And so it gave them a heads up on what we were looking for in phase 1 and phase 2, so they could kind of get started, because we knew we were going to move fast with this. And so and speaking to industry, afterwards, that was very helpful in the success of the actual requirement.
And when you put out the draft solicitation, you mentioned you put out a draft statement of work.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get many questions from industry?
Did we? Career high. We got 422 questions, and that may seem like a lot, but we moved through them very fast. Some of them were redundant, and with the help of legal, the program office, myself, some of the other contracting officers that were assisting, we got them answered and got them back out to industry so they could move forward with the actual requirements. So 422 questions, career high. The questions just kept coming. And so we got them all together and got them answered and kept moving.
And as a former contracting officer, I'm sure I can say that it's definitely easier to get those questions before the solicitation is released, when you're still in that draft mode, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we got the questions as part of the question answer period of the solicitation. And so we answered the question, and then the actual phase 1 proposals were due.
Gotcha. All right. So this technique too, having a draft solicitation, is really easy to apply. If you have just a few days or maybe a week before you release your solicitation, anyone out there can send out a draft, whether it's just a solicitation factors, whether it's the whole thing, whether it's part of your statement of work. And it's really easy. It's really nice to get that industry feedback earlier rather than later.
Hey, Scott, that looks like me.
Does, doesn't it?
Well, you know what? We have a series for you today throughout this webinar. We'll have some PIL teaching moments that pop up. And I am, let's say, Professor Wagner for the day. And I got the white starting in my beard, so I'm not too far from being, from really being that long in the tooth. But after every PIL procurement, we engage industry to find out what they thought of the innovative techniques the team tried. This is our opportunity to learn, reinforce what worked, and tweak what needs to be changed. So let's go to the next slide and see what industry thought of our pre-solicitation collaboration. Now, what I can see here is industry always likes the opportunity to collaborate with government. You heard Sharon say it, Monique, Scott, and even Bobby, but they really love to do it before the solicitation is released. So let's read a couple thoughts. Let's see. One vendor said that these were 100% effective. Another said getting a sense of what the government was looking for and how they were planning to evaluate was appreciated in terms of being able to prepare our approach. And lastly, sharing as much as possible the information in advance is just so helpful. You're going to get a better solution and quality of response the more information we have and the longer we prepare. So I echo Scott's sentiments. If you're on the government side, I would do a draft solicitation with as much as I can share 100% of the time, get the Q&As done at that point. Maybe you don't need another round of Q&As. You can just get them done there and tell industry, hey, we're not looking to do Q&As in the final stage. We're going to get them done now. You'll be amazed how streamlined that can make your solicitation milestone schedule once it's fully released. Now, Scott, before I turn it back to you, I did want to look at the poll and see, hey, what's the temperature of our audience? How much are you sharing with industry in advance of a requirement? Well, 16% said everything. Good. You guys might not even need to listen to us anymore. But then 17% said nothing. So we have our polar extremes there. Right in the middle, 40% just the statement of work, and then 29% said sometimes the solicitation. So we definitely want to edge those numbers up, and we want to share as much as we can, even if it's not perfect, right? That's okay. Draft solicitations are part of market research. And Alethea out there says, what if your entity is constrained to not advertise until funding is in place? Well, maybe that's a specific entity, but draft solicitations are considered market research. And you do market research at all times of any acquisition. So market research is independent of funding being in place. A draft solicitation is market research. So let's think about it that way. Back to you, Scott.
That's a great point. Thanks very much, Trevor. All right, we need to step back into the time machine now before we talk about this next technique. Just about a year ago, again, we're 9 months into the pandemic, medical staff were really beginning to feel burnout. There have been tons of cases in the ICU. Now they are being asked to vaccinate people as well. There was this real concern within FEMA that you might award these 2 IDIQs only for them not to be able to hire anybody out there. So Sharon, tell us about your phase 1 evaluation approach. You're on mute again, Sharon.
There we go. So we split the solicitation up into 2 phases, and we made corporate experience our most important factor. And so in corporate experience, we wanted to make sure, see, this is something we never bought before. So putting 2 vendors on the ground that would not be able to staff this requirement would be heartbreaking. So we wanted to make sure up front that we had vendors that were able to actually do the requirements. So we made corporate experience the most important factor and the first phase. And so the down select would come after if we got proposals from vendors that were not able that didn't have experience doing this type of requirement on a massive scale. So we had smaller staffing companies. We wanted the management piece that actually went along with that. So we structured the corporate experience, and we asked for a few things. You know, we wanted contractors that had worked on simultaneous task orders at the same time. We wanted contractors that had worked on big contracts at the same time. So there were things in the corporate experience that they needed to provide to us to give us a high confidence level that they could do this requirement, and therefore we moved them on to phase 2.
And I really loved that last question that we all crafted together about failure. You all asked, tell us about a time where you didn't meet the contract requirements and how you mitigated and resolved that failure. Monique, how did that question and the mission-focused evaluation criteria help you overcome all the obstacles that you were facing?
Well, there were great proposals where a lot of the offers were very forthright with some of the mistakes they had made and what they have learned and how they are considering incorporating a lot of those ideas on the contract if they were to be chosen. So that honesty really helped us to examine their full capability, their maybe management team's way of thinking, that they know how to do problem solving. Because it was something that was really a great concern to us. How are we going to accomplish, potentially deploying thousands of people under the COVID pandemic environment with all the logistics challenges? And it was really appreciated that a lot of the vendors thought that out and were forthright in providing the kind of issues that they had experienced and the solutions that they came up with.
Now, I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there too that are like, if I put that into a solicitation, there's no way that a vendor is going to come back and actually tell me about a time when they failed. Was that your experience, or did everyone have a failure they talked about?
Certainly the vendors who receive higher rating ultimately were very elaborative in the mistakes that they had made, lessons that they learned that they made, and they actually kind of bragged about how they became a better company from that result. Versus the vendors who are maybe just starting out or are not as experienced, some may have omitted that portion of the proposal.
My daughter's had a skating coach, and the skating coach used to say, if you're not falling, you're not learning. And so the best companies will take these failures, they'll learn forward, and like Monique said, they're proud of them. Now, you only gave 5 pages to provide their responses for this whole section. Monique, was that easy to evaluate for you?
Yes, and it was extremely helpful. During market research phase, like you had mentioned, when we posted the draft statement of work and solicitation, we received from over 25 vendors. So we were already anticipating that there were going to be a lot of proposals that we're going to have to evaluate. Lo and behold, it ended up being more than double of that number. So had we made it a longer page requirement, then there was no way that our team could have evaluated all those pages proposals within a very short amount of time, because we were really under self-imposed pressure to get this awarded really fast. So we were glad that it was only 5 pages per proposal, but if 5 pages is sufficient enough for us to get a really good idea of each vendor's capability.
Yeah. And Sharon, how was it for you evaluating as the CEO? What did you like about this short proposals?
Well, I think we talked about this beforehand, and I think we limited it to 5 pages because we wanted the contractors to get to the point. I know all the contractors out here have had a lot of fluff. There was no room to fluff. By the time you gave us what we asked for, you hit the high points, and there was no fluff in any of the proposals. So it was easy for us to, it was easy for the technical team to evaluate the proposals and as the contractors actually got to the point in their first phase, because it was only limited to 5 pages. So they had to be creative in getting to the point. So that's what we wanted.
And we do have some contractors that come back afterwards and they say, well, it's too short, but here you
Right.
have 1 page per question. And your questions were very condensed and on point. And so, Trevor, what did industry think about this technique, how it was applied?
Well, what did it? They love the technique. Now, if there's one thing that you're going to use, that if you're going to remember if you're using brief proposal submissions, is that you must right size your evaluation factors. You can't just take huge, unwieldy technical management approach, past performance and price, assign X amount of pages for each procurement. It's simply just not going to work. So some of our quotes here is brief proposal submissions are the shining spot of the whole process. Wow, that's a pretty emphatic statement. You save money because you aren't preparing for things that won't matter if you weren't advised to proceed to the next phase. That's a really critical point, and we'll touch on that a little bit more on best practices for our down selects. And mission-focused evaluation criteria allow you to describe your solution better and get it more evaluated more effectively. I couldn't agree more, but again, do we need 400 pages for a $1 billion IDIQ? Maybe not. Do we need 4 pages? Maybe that's too little. We have to right size what we need to select the best partner. Back to you.
I love the booster shot there of innovation, that brief proposal submission saves time. Gotta love it. And that's on both sides, right? It saves time for them to write and it saves time for us to evaluate. All right. Now, the next technique that you all used was one that we've talked around a little bit. It's the advisory down select, where you went from many vendors in phase 1 to less vendors in phase 2. Sharon, what made you want to use this technique after you finished your market research?
Monique stated earlier, the market research showed that we were going to get a lot of proposals. And so advisory down select was a way of making sure that we only move the qualified vendors over to the next phase. And as I think you're going to show in another slide here, we received a great deal of proposals. I think it's going to knock the socks off people to know how many proposals we actually received. And that day they just kept coming. I remember when we got to 30, we were like, holy crap, 30 proposals. And then we got to 40. And then I think you'll show the number that we actually got to. So if we hadn't had that advisory down select in there, there's no way we would have gotten through this very quickly. So that's my all-time favorite PIL technique, the advisory down select. I use it in every single thing that I do. If market research shows that we're going to get a lot of proposals. And so it's just a way of making sure that the highly confident vendors move forward.
Now, you had talked earlier about if you hadn't had that brief proposal submission, 54 even at just 10 pages, is this enormous book. But 54 at just 5 pages, well, that's a lot more digestible. Right? So you evaluated 54 proposals and you decided that 6 were the most highly rated. You advised those 6 to proceed to phase 2. Now you sent out the advisory letters on like Wednesday at 5 o'clock and you gave them 24 hours to decide. What happened in the morning?
The next day, we received notices from 19 vendors that they wanted to move forward. So, and ultimately that 19 went down to 11, but going from 54 to 19 down to 11, I would say that PIL technique worked in this instance.
Definitely. I mean, 11 is 20% of 54. So you went from 100% down to 20%. That's a good down select. And in between, when you got those 19, I remember, you know, the conversations we had on that day, kind of scrambling to figure out what to do. And we ended up sending out a bit more information for them to remind them that phase 1 was the most important factor. You know, all the other factors were less important than phase 1. And so if they weren't being advised to move forward, there was a lower chance that they were going to be likely to be successful in that second phase. Did any of the vendors you advised not to proceed do well during phase 2, Sharon?
Ask that question again, Scott.
Did any of the vendors that you advised not to proceed end up doing well in phase 2 for those that did proceed?
Well, we did have some, I will say that we did have some surprises for some of the vendors that moved forward. They did better than we expected to, but I'll say that the vendors that we had high confidence in phase 1 that we suggested to move forward also did well in phase 2 because that capability was there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trevor, I'm sure our audience is wondering, what are some best practices out there if they're considering an advisory downsell?
Did you say advisory down select and best practices?
I did.
Oh man. Well, while I go ahead and talk your ear off about this, please answer the poll question that's up on advisory down selects. Now, what you see here are allow time between the phases, and that's critical. And that ties back to that first comment we heard of, well, I didn't work on my phase 2 volume because I was waiting on the response. And if you don't allow enough time, guess what happens? Vendors are just going to proceed and spend their bid proposal costs anyway. So at least 2 weeks is important. First phase, light but meaningful. This is very important. And this ties in with the other one. They must be light and meaningful, but they have to stay in the best value trade-off. We've had teams that have not included phase 1 factor in their best value trade-off. And guess what? All of the vendors proceeded to phase 2 because it wasn't included in the trade-off. So these are really important considerations. The third one, and our advisory notifications, we do put in there that we're going to allow 48 to 72 hours to consider. That would be the text in the solicitation. So we'll send out that notification and tell them, hey, you have 48 hours to email the CO back of whether or not you are proceeding. That way, we have our phase 2 pool set. We know how many we're going to have. And the last one, please restate your level of importance of evaluation factors in the notification. It is very important. It might seem redundant, but we do want to be clear about how these decisions carry over and affect the overall trade-off.
And those last two, if I can jump in, those last two are direct lessons learned from this procurement that were either relearned or learned for the first time. You know, as we talked about, the team gave them the advisory notices about 5 o'clock on Wednesday. And a lot of people got those notices the next morning when they came into the office at 9 a.m. And they only had about 8 hours left. And so the first thing that they did, instead of going to talk about it, was they just hit reply, yes, I want to proceed. That was a bunch of the 19 that wanted to proceed that were later didn't. So there was about 8 of them like that. If you give them enough time, that 48 hours to 72 hours, what happens is they can slow roll it. You know, they grew through all the periods of grief, you know, anger and acceptance, whatever else. But what they'll do is They go and they talk to their boss, and their boss controls the purse strings. And their boss says, you need $100,000 to proceed? And the government is telling us not to proceed? No, we're not going to proceed. And so if they have that time to think about it, they'll think about it and come to the decision. That's not to say it's all the time, but it's about 99% of the time. All right, I'll turn it back to you, Trevor.
Well, that does it for my my key takeaways and lessons learned here, but I did want to share the outcomes of the poll question. And that question was, have you ever used or been part of an advisory down select? 25% yes, and I love the process. And about 7% yes, and it wasn't as great as I thought it would be. Well, maybe some of these weren't followed as directly, or maybe they were, and you just had some unique circumstance. Well, that's where we come in, you know? Email the PIL. Scott and I are we happy to talk about that approach. No, and I can't wait to try it. 61%. That's great. I'm glad we're spending the amount of time on this that we are. No, it doesn't sound like it's for me. And that's 6% of the folks out there. And Scott, one thing I'll say is, you know, what happened if they included an advisory down select and they only got six proposals in? Could they still have used the down select?
For sure, right? Maybe all 6 are high confidence and you just move those 6 into phase 2. But maybe only 3 of them are high confidence, or you only have, you know, maybe there's the most highly rated are just 3. And so you move those 3 into phase 2 or advise those 3 to move into phase 2, but you have still went from 6 to 3. And so if you've got, say, a 20-page phase 2 response, you'd go from 120 pages to read down to 60 pages to read, which is a lot better. The other thing it does is it makes your trade-off document a lot tighter. If you have to do a best value trade-off decision with 6 vendors, well, we've all been there, right? But it's a little difficult. If you can do a best value trade-off decision with just 3 vendors, that is perfect. You've basically got 1 winner and 2 who did not win. And you're just doing that discussion there. So you can do a lot more pinpoint discussion. Your document is right and tight. The other thing that it does, of course, is it reduces protest risk. So if you have 6 vendors in phase 2, well, there's 1 winner and 5 people who didn't win, 5 people can protest. If I have 3 vendors in phase 2, well, I have 1 winner and 2 protesters, I've decreased my protest risk by 60%. It's just the math. All right. Any questions in the chat we need to cover, Trevor, before we move on?
Oh, no, not at this moment.
Okay, let's keep cruising. All right. During phase 1, you had that 5-page written submission that we've talked about. And during phase 2, you had this hybrid approach. You had 12 pages of written response to discuss technical and staffing approach. And then you had a 2-hour oral presentation. Monique, what made you so passionate about having an oral presentation here?
So in the written proposal, we had asked about their technical approach and their management approach, how they would come up with a process to streamline the deployment or the logistical processes. So that would be like a textbook case. And then during oral presentation, we gave them some scenarios for them to tell us how they would apply what they have written in those kind of unique scenarios and challenging environment that we would throw at them.
And what was it like to evaluate that hybrid submission, the mixture of written and oral? Did you notice any trends between the vendors that did well in writing and the vendors that did well in oral?
Certainly, we did see a trend with people who, vendors who provided very solid written proposal, doing very well also during oral presentation. Their management team really showed up to demonstrate that they can do not just a written communication, but verbal communication in telling us what their ideas are and what their approach will be, versus vendors who were not so highly rated on the written, definitely showed up also in oral presentation as well. They were very, sometimes kind of caught off guard with the questions that we asked them. So it was like a gotcha moment, and that was kind of fun for us, but it really helped us to understand what their true capabilities are like.
Excellent. Now I know that I just redid my roof and it cost me, $10,000. And when I was talking to the different vendors that came out to check my roof, you know, I really had this confidence when I was talking to them. I had read about them all online, and I kind of thought I knew who I was going to, but I was never going to commit to buying that roof before I talked to them. And that was just for $10,000. Monique, did you ever consider awarding these two $1.2 billion IDIQs without actually talking to the vendors who are going to do the work?
I don't think that would have been fair to the taxpayers, the American, you know, people that we're buying this very expensive service blindly.
And one that's super critical, right? Like, you were looking at replacing all those frontline workers out there who've been working a lot of hours and getting these vaccines into the arms of the American public to try to like slow the pandemic down. So of course you're going to talk to the people who are doing the work. So as you mentioned, you know, there's lots of different types of oral presentations. You can have an oral presentation, you can have a product demonstration, you can have a coding challenge. Sharon, what kind of oral presentation would you say you had here? But we will.
So the oral presentations that we did was scenario based. So the vendors could, the solicitation stated that the vendors could bid on both the east zone and the west zone. And so depending on which zone they bid on, we gave them a scenario question either in Florida or the other, or another one on the west zone. So the contractors were given the scenario-based questions right when we got on the actual oral presentation. They were given 30 minutes to go in a breakout room in Zoom and caucus and come up with an actual response. And so based on how they provided those responses, we did on-the-spot consensus right after that actual oral presentation, which was very helpful because once they were done, we actually, the technical team actually evaluated it right then. And so each oral presentation was done that way. And so, yeah, so I would say it was scenario based on every vendor was given the same question. If they were on the East Zone, they were given the same question to be fair between vendors.
And these so rich and ready for it. You on the left-hand side, you can see really like you set the stage, you know, with what day it is, how many task orders they've had, how many they've got them deployed. And then you give them this really detailed scenario of they're in South Florida. Now this hurricane is coming. What are you going to do? And it is just amazing to see the vendors when they have these. I've been using oral presentations for a long time, and you can always see, you know, right away, you talk about that fearfulness, right? Monique talked about how like you can see that fear. And so when they get this question, sometimes you can just see the eyes go open a little bit and then they settle in, and some teams get it done and some teams don't. But a really great way to see who can think on their feet during a disaster, which, you know, this is. So Monique, this wasn't your first time with oral presentations. How did the scenario-based questions compare to your other oral presentation experience?
In other oral presentations, we kind of let the vendor take the lead and tell us about their capability and explain what they're offering to us. In this situation, by government taking control and giving them a scenario that could very well be very real life that could happen to us, especially at FEMA, we are very keenly aware of the hurricane season approaching. There were definitely a difference between the vendors who were prepared, they appreciate the question, and then the other vendors who were off the bat told us this is very challenging, and they really stumbled. So I kind of like this scenario-based questions more than more scripted oral presentation in the other times that I've done, because I really we got to witness how the management team collaborated and in short amount of time and came up with solutions to the problems that were challenging them with.
There's a lot of different names for this technique. Sometimes it's predetermined questions. Sometimes it's scenario-based. Sometimes it's oral presentations with a twist. Trevor, if someone in the audience wants to use oral presentations on their next solicitation, what are some best practices they can use?
Oh, well, Scott, I am so glad that you asked. And you know what? I'll start with one that's not on the page, and that is right sizing. We talked about that for our proposal submissions, and Freddie Jordan in the chat said, they're great. I think a very important factor is the amount of time that you have. That's right. We have had oral presentations span 30 minutes to what, 4 hours or all day for some. Now, those might have been combined with demos because you can't talk for that long all in one. But you see here, the first one is replace, don't add, right? If you are going to do something orally, whether it's with a virtual oral presentation or a phone interview, then do it there. We don't need a 5-minute technical approach as well as a 5-page technical paper on the same subject. So please replace, don't add. The FAR gives us so much leeway of what we can include in oral presentations. It is literally everything. Please feel free to read the FAR reference on what you can include. We've done many purely virtual oral presentations as the entire proposal submission process. Phone interviews, virtual orals, or even when they were in person. That's really important. The second one there, and this is don't have vendors read their proposals. It is really pointless if you're having someone regurgitate something, or if you're going to have them come in with an absolutely scripted response. We actually had a team who did a oral presentation as their pure technical submission in the second phase. The first phase was a phone interview, and the vendor came in with questions prepared and started reading from a script. And that reduced the confidence of the team. And that was actually a court of federal claims case that came up. And it was pretty resounding. Hey, even though the government didn't say that you had to, you couldn't read from a script, the fact that you did reduce their confidence in, sometimes that's life. Now, Scott, how does this one hit you? Ask questions.
I don't know, Trevor. I feel a little nervous about asking questions.
Well, what we can tell you is we have a litany, and I think we're going to get into this soon, but a litany of decisions that we have supported that say that questions are okay. Not just questions, but unique and tailored questions. And I won't steal the thunder on a future slide, but it is important that you ask questions, because questions, especially in the interactive dialogue portion, because it says ensure time for dialogue, those are really what can set vendors apart and instill confidence in the government that they understand the work and can perform it. So if you're doing an oral presentation that doesn't allow for questions and dialogue, then at some point, why are you doing the oral presentation? You're missing such a vital component for the government to really understand who can do the work. Because we've seen procurements, right, Scott, where if they could have just asked those questions or been empowered by the team, because we have our poll question out there now, and I can tell you that 3% of the respondents, when we asked, have you ever used scenario-based questions as part of an oral presentation, say, no, I am not allowed to. Well, maybe we can get some of that empowerment that Bobby was talking about. That would be really important for something like dialogue. Last one, set the ground rules of who can participate. It might shock some of our government folks to understand that what are the ground rules of who can participate? Well, that's up to us to decide. There really isn't a prescription of you can or can't have these folks there. Typically, if you have to have key personnel, maybe there's a few key personnel you want. Do they have to be part of the prime contractor? It's certainly an element that you can set up. What about subcontractors, Scott? Do we want the same sub coming in for every oral presentation in phase 2?
We did have that once, and so we had to amend the solicitation, and the team said no. A subcontractor has to choose one prime vendor to team with for the oral presentations. They can participate in just one, and they can team with others if they want to. Now,
that's right. And I think that the last thing for me on this one, before we cover the poll questions, is just another pitch for right sizing. And I've seen a complicated billion-dollar procurement for data center support services that was really a 45-minute oral presentation on just 3 questions, because they were the right 3 questions the government needed, right? If you ask the right questions, you don't need hours and hours, and you don't need 100 pages in your response. You can really just get to the nitty gritty. What is going to help me make my decision on is this the right partner or not? So Scott, do you want me to share those polls before you get back to it?
Before we get to it, I think some people out there might have a question about, can I use oral presentations in a virtual environment? And if so, how do I do that?
Well, look at that. It's got a little virtual reality headset on. That's a great question, Scott. And last year, when this whole virtual world really popped up on us, our senior procurement executive at the time, Soraya Correa, released a memo called "Virtualizing the Procurement Process," and it really was kind of a roadmap of how do we consider doing all of our oral presentations or demos or consensus evaluations all virtually. And so what we've done is really just shift our solicitation language to pretty much doing them all virtually at this point. And that's one of the things that the FAR tells us is great to do for small businesses. And it actually allows us to really accommodate quicker transitions. You don't have to find conference rooms. Our virtual platforms seem to work pretty seamless now. But one thing that we'll talk about, Scott, is screen fatigue. So do you want to have a 6-hour oral presentation all in one day, Scott?
I don't.
Does anybody out there want to sit through the same oral presentation, either as an evaluator or giving the pitch all in one day? If it's absolutely critical, maybe you consider breaking it up into multiple days or just reducing the time for how long it takes. All right, so Scott, how about the poll question now?
Let's get to the poll question, and then I think there's a good question in the chat too for the team. Let's do the poll.
There's a couple.
Right.
And I'll pin one of those up for you, Scott. If you can scroll up and read Chenille Green's question and have that one ready to go. What type of documentation was used to record the discussions and results of the oral? And then Fatima Akhtar asked a question after that. So we'll get to those two. But have you ever used scenario-based questions as part of an oral presentation? And I'll share those results for everybody to see. Yes, they really blew me away. I thought it was better than normal. No, but I'm brewing to try them. I see what you did there, Scott. And then again, 4 folks said no, and I am not allowed to. Well, if you're looking for somebody to not tell you that you can, but to work with you to reduce the uneasiness that comes with it, well, we're happy to support you. So please just give us a shout, and we will we'll brainstorm something with you.
All right, let's get to these questions here. I think the first one is from Chenille, and it's for Sharon. We'll teach Chenille and Sharon together. What type of documentation was used to either record the discussions or results of the oral presentation? Sharon? Well, let's take you off mute so everyone can hear your answer.
Yep. Monique, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure that we recorded these.
We did not, but we had 2 scribers.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So we had 2 scribers, only because we did on the spot consensus and we had a lot of vendors to go through. We thought it was necessary and appropriate to request the assistance of scribers. And so right after the oral presentations were done,
you're getting
you're
stealing thunder later.
Okay,
So,
all right.
That's great. So the
Yeah.
FAR does say that you should have a record, and that record can be many different things. It can be like Sharon talked about, a scribe, your notes from it. It can also be, you can state that it's the consensus evaluation report. That can be a note.
Yep.
The other thing that you can do is you can have sort of a hybrid approach, and you can say, well, the official record is going to be, our notes, our transcriber notes, but we will also have the PowerPoint to aid in memory. Or we will also record, press the record button in Zoom to aid in memory, but that will not be the official record. And the GAO has looked at that and said, okay, well, we just want to see the official record. And so if that official record is the transcription, well, good. We don't need to see the actual video recording or the PowerPoints or anything else. And of course, that's easy to do now. There's even a button in MS Teams, I think, maybe in other ones as well, that will provide you with the transcript that you can clean up a little bit. The second question is for Monique. It comes from Fatima. And she asks, what's the government looking for in the scenario-based questions? Are they looking for how well the question is answered, how well the team works together, or if the question was answered correctly? So Monique, what were you looking for in the scenario-based question responses?
Main thing was how are they really applying what they say they're going to do that was provided in the written proposal, and applying those principles that they submitted in those scenarios. So for example, a lot of the vendors would talk about their logistics processes with wheels and diagrams and whatnot. So how did that translate to actually, you know, if you're working on a new task order that we're about to provide to you, but oh, by the way, this is going to be a 13th task order, you're already working on 12. And also there's going to be a hurricane that's, you know, going to be hitting southern coast of Florida. Those were the actual scenario based questions. And we wanted to see how they would be able to bring those terminology and concepts back from the written and explain to us in the oral presentation in that scenario-based situations.
Awesome. Trevor, anything to add there?
Yeah, and it really dovetails into, you know, we can ask for questions in the solicitation, but then they can be scripted and prepared against, like someone in the chat said from FDIC. Well, we gave them their questions when they arrived, and we gave them an hour to prepare for them. Well, that way you make sure the right team is in the room, so that they can't really be completely scripted because they're coming up with the response on their own. Or the other way, it's going to be the next slide, really kind of those on the spot questions. But for Fatima's responses, are you looking at how well the question is answered? Yeah, of course. How well the team works together, that can really matter as well. I've had teams that say that everybody has to respond to each question, or a different person has to respond to each question. There have been situations where one person responded for the entire team, and do we really want the strength of a proposal from a company to lie on one person? That doesn't really indicate strength across the team. So that can certainly matter, especially when you're buying like agile development teams. Or if the question was answered correctly. If it is a question that kind of has a correct or incorrect connotation to it, well, that really matters if you can't answer a question incorrectly, even if it's a basic level question. So depending on your industry set, if you need questions to weed folks out, you can approach it that way. Or, Scott, what's another way we can approach questions? That's your lead into slide 23.
There you go. And so a big part of oral presentations are not just hearing from the vendors, but having that opportunity to ask them questions, right? So Sharon, what inspired you to include this interactive dialogue during the oral presentations?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we had a chance to go back to the vendors to ask any questions on something that maybe they said, maybe that we didn't understand, maybe an acronym, and so the government caucused on our own in a breakout room, and all of this is on Zoom, caucused on our own to draft and vet our own questions that we had, that we could go back to the vendors. Our legal team was present and vetted any questions before we went back to ask the team. That's the way we chose to do it. And other teams can likely be creative in how they go back and forth with the vendors. That's how we chose to do it, to make sure we didn't enter into any discussions or anything, but we drafted our questions, and then we got back on Zoom and asked the vendors any questions that we needed to
and Sharon brings up a great point that each of the innovation techniques we talk about is a spectrum, and you as a team have to come up with how comfortable you are with that, whether at the conservative end of the spectrum or the progressive end of the spectrum, wherever you fall within that. And that's why Sharon's collaboration early with her attorney and with her team was so important, because they got to know each other. They got to know where they were on the spectrum, right? They could have that conversation. You never want to have this conversation with your team like the half hour before oral presentations, right? You want to have that discussion earlier. Now, Sharon brings up discussions, but the GAO is very clear that as long as they're not given an opportunity to revise what was said earlier, then it's discussions, because that is an important prerequisite for discussions. Sharon, did you ask anything about the written or just the oral?
Just the oral.
Yep. And did you ask each vendor the same question, or was it responsive to what they had said?
No, it was based on the information that they gave us when they presented their speech. So every vendor likely had a different question, and so every vendor did have a different question based on the information that they gave us.
Yeah. And this technique actually comes straight from the FAR, which says that oral presentations can provide an opportunity for dialogue among the parties.
Right.
Monique, after the oral presentations, Sharon mentioned that you caucused to discuss whether there were any questions. What kind of questions did the evaluation team ask of vendors?
So we were careful in crafting the questions that we asked that were not leading questions, kind of feeding them and giving them a chance to improve upon their presentation or the written, but kind of open-ended so that it gives them a chance for them to volunteer the approaches that they have mentioned and enhance what they had meant.
Yeah. And so we talked about the scenario-based question, and Fatima asked if there was kind of an answer key, which, you know, there's not. You just want to see what their answer is like. And so Monique's not, there was never like a wink, wink, would you consider doing this, wink, wink, right?
Yes.
No, it's all about, tell me more about something. You mentioned you're going to get 100 more people to help vaccinations. Tell me more about that. You mentioned that you're going to evacuate them using a boat. Where are you going to get the boat from? You know, like if they're coming, it's all expanding on and clarifying on those things. Now you did have a unique approach here, because in phase 2, you had one non-price factor, just that staffing and management, that was made up of the two parts, the written and the oral. What did you see, Monique, between the differences between those two parts?
Definitely enhancement in oral presentation from what they were presenting in the written proposal, but also, like you guys mentioned earlier, the dynamic of the presenters that were there from each vendor. We had some presenters who kind of took over the entire process and dominated the discussion and didn't really allow other people, key personnel that we would in normal day-to-day basis would be interacting with. And there were other vendors who had kind of let the bigger subcontractor take the lead. So we kind of saw those kind of like cues, not that they were part of our evaluation, but it kind of helped us to tie what they were saying, what they had provided to us in the written proposal.
Yeah, it definitely helps to inform that decision, right? And gives you a better of the overall vendor posture. Sharon, what trends did you see between the written and the oral presentation?
I'll say the oral presentation gave us confidence that the vendor knew what they were talking about in the written portion. I'll just say that.
And was there a vendor that did really well in the written portion, but then tanked the oral, or vice versa?
I would say not necessarily tanked, but maybe I'll say this: the vendors who did well on the written did very well on the oral presentation, and the vendors we had a couple of surprises. The vendors that we suggested not to move forward didn't do well on the oral presentations because the capability really wasn't there. So I'll say that.
Can you imagine having had to make that award decision without the oral presentations?
No, I'll say the vendors that we thought were very good on the oral presentation, and we were able to move forward that way.
Trevor, we've got lots of best practices here. We've been talking about a lot of them, how, you know, oral presentations help to round out your evaluation approach and everything else. What kind of best practices do you have for people?
All right, when we're specifically talking about interactive dialogue, I would think the most important thing is don't be afraid to ask that question, right? That's really the temperament we see sometimes in either the culture in a specific office or with a person leading that office, is they want to stop the team from asking certain questions. And what we've learned from our multiple bid protests that we review is, interactive dialogue is kind of like Las Vegas, right? What you say there stays there, or at least that's how it should be. So we don't want to import aspects of it to another factor that was previously evaluated. And as long as they say it in that oral presentation, that is part of the oral presentation. There is no revising it. It is all occurring within the confines of how you set it up. So do allow time in between either the vendor's presentation or that caucus period from the government, like you saw in the previous slide. That is very important because you want to be able to have that conversation with your other evaluators and then ask that. But aside from that, it's those in-depth back and forth elements of, okay, you said this, did you really mean this? Yes, okay, take me further. And it's really diving down the rabbit hole into some of those questions where we find, the juiciest nuggets, where we find the best discriminators in our process. Because if you're looking for discriminators, this is the place where our teams say that the decision of who to award to can oftentimes hinge on the back and forth Q&A between government and industry. And also let them ask some questions. Let them clarify what you're trying to ask, because they're the industry experts. So we might not be asking the right question. But if you limit them into saying, hey, we will be the only ones asking questions here, then that's also tough. And to tie back one last principle, Scott, from the oral presentations, if you are doing these virtually, we recommend that the entire team be on camera, because it's really important that if I'm a vendor here giving my pitch and I see a bunch of blank screens or all I see is a contracting officer, that's somewhat problematic. There's still a fair amount of nonverbal communication we can get from each other. And if you're asking a question or you look confused, well, that would have occurred in the room for an oral presentation. And so those are still helpful to have organically in this type of environment. So don't be afraid to ask questions. If you run into a sticky situation, you're like, hey, these are the ones we're considering. Well, make sure you ping them back with your contracting officer, and then they're the facilitators of this session, and they will be able to provide the comfort of we shouldn't or we should ask this question.
And I think one of the other principles too is that during the prepared kind of scenario-based response, right? That's the vendor's time. If they have an hour, we give them an hour and we don't interrupt them. That's their 60 minutes. The interactive dialogue, that's the government's time. So we can interrupt a little bit more and say, no, that's not what I meant. Or no, you've answered that question. I want to get to the other 5 questions that I have. That's your time. And so, interrupt, use that wisely. If the vendor has answered the question, have them move along so you can get to all of the interactive dialogue questions you have. And if you're stuck, just take a pause, go back to caucus for a second, and then come back and say, here's what we want to ask. So great best practices there. Are there any questions in the chat before we move on, Trevor?
No, I don't see any.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to, I think, the next and last innovation technique that they applied here. Have you ever read a book and you're trying to recall all of the major plot points for a friend about what you liked? Or maybe you've had a marathon movie session and now you're trying to recall which of the movies was best and why. Evaluating proposals in the traditional approach where you read them all or watch them all and then evaluate them, well, that's sort of like those two experiences. But we have an innovation technique to try to help with this problem, and it's called on-the-spot consensus. Sharon, you used this technique for both phases. How did it work just in phase 1?
So in phase 1, as you mentioned earlier, we had 54 proposals. So getting through that was a little bit of a beast, but it was organized. And so as I said earlier, we requested the assistance of a scriber, and Monique did all the scheduling of what proposal we were going to, the technical team was going to do at what time. We even scheduled breaks, but the on-the-spot consensus, after one vendor was done, the on-the-spot consensus, the actual write-up was done. So after we got through all of the vendors, the actual technical document for the first phase was completed. Other than doing some spell checking and a little bit of formatting, which Monique did, after the last proposal was done and the technical team got together and decided what rating they were going to give them. It was actually done. So the on-the-spot consensus was very helpful in moving quickly through the actual phase 1 proposals. And we actually used them for phase 2 also because it worked very well. The technical document for the first phase, Monique, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 68 pages. And for the second phase was 90 plus pages. So having the on-the-spot consensus and having the write-ups done right after the team read the proposals was very helpful.
And so in this technique, you mentioned you had 54 proposals. And so you read one proposal, and then instead of having the team do all that individual work, they just came together in a Zoom meeting like we have now, and they did an on-the-spot consensus right away.
Right.
Someone shared the screen. Monique, I think, was sharing her screen, right? And she typed up notes as we went along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And so the first 3 or 4 was a little slow. And then once the team knew what they were looking for, it picked up. And sometimes the technical team would read like 2 or 3 proposals, and then we would get back and do the write-ups for those. But we got through it in what, 3 days, Monique?
Yeah, the team kept a very impressive cadence of evaluating 15 proposals a day, working through the weekends from 8 a.m. to like 8 p.m. I think we went over 12 hours of a day sometimes to go through all of that. Yeah, so it was in a very short period amount of time.
Right.
Yeah, because you guys were chunking it out. You weren't reading 15 proposals and then doing it, right? You were reading 4 and then doing a consensus.
Right.
Yeah. Really efficient way to get to it. Now, in phase 2, Monique, you had combined oral presentations now on the spot, plus the written phase 2. So how did that work, and how many oral presentations did you do in each day?
We did 2 oral presentations a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. We gave ourselves at least like 3 hours for the entire oral presentation and caucus and quick note-taking to come up with a consensus report. We did this approach again because we needed to immediately put it out, regurgitate what we had in our brains, because there was no way that by afternoon, after we had gone through another offer, we would have forgotten everything that we had about from the previous oral presentation.
And how did it work with the written, combining it with the written? Did you guys have an individual consensus for the written and then the oral? How did that work?
We did. We started off with the written because we came in having read the written proposal. So we had to come up with a partial rating on the written proposal. And when we did the oral presentation and we had scribers write a separate note, we combined the notes into the initial version of the written proposal consensus as well. So then at the end, it became a full document.
Because that was one of the challenges you had, or one of the unique kind of elements was that you had one factor with those 2 elements of written and oral. And like you said, you did each of them and then you combine them at the end for one evaluation factor. And so you had the one evaluation factor from phase 1. And then if they moved into phase 2, they got a second one. And with prices, you only had 2 evaluation factors to really consider in your trade-off.
Yep.
Yeah. This is another approach that I recommend to all of the teams. It really streamlines the evaluation process. There's nothing in the FAR that requires that individual evaluation report prior to consensus. It's just somewhere that along the way we picked it up because it was introduced to address a specific problem, and that person didn't think about all of the ramifications throughout history after that. So by going to just that group consensus, we can save time, we reduce paperwork, and we avoid any unnecessary reviews. And Monique, this is, I think, your quote that that this was the best technique of actually the whole thing.
Yes, it was, because just because of the sheer volume, the number of documents that we had to go through, and how fast we were going at it. So just doing a very concise and impactful evaluation per vendor and dedicating that hour or 2 of time, government time in evaluating and pouring out the report, and then moving on, and then knowing that we gave each vendor a full consideration. I think this was a very important and most useful evaluation technique that I will probably use again in the future.
Awesome. And I think the results from all of your innovation techniques, they speak for themselves. You awarded not one, but two $2.6 billion IDIQ contracts. That's billion with a B. And you did it in 79 days. Some solicitations are out there for 79 days.
Right.
Since then, there have been 109 task orders awarded for a value of over $95 million obligated. And over 10,000 federal and contractor staff have cycled through these community vaccine clinics to offer the COVID-19 vaccines to the American public, resulting in almost 200 million Americans vaccinated. I mean, your innovations just speak for themselves in the results here. I think this is an amazing result. Trevor, what did industry think when we asked them about the awards?
Well, there is a new poll up, and this is getting to the government and industry perspective for a few industry folks who are out there. Now, we like this. We like this more proactive approach. Yeah, let's do it. Let's be more proactive. Even a vendor that didn't win, we would have liked to have won, but it was very well executed. Well, that means a lot. That means a lot to us, even when sometimes the unsuccessful folks give good feedback. Considering what you were doing, it came together well and really fast. Well, I'm glad they see kind of like the duck that's sitting above the water, not the legs that are churning underneath. And it's encouraging to me that people are looking at process improvement and quality improvement. Well, I hope that's what each of our teams are looking at, almost each and every single day. And for our question that was out there, have you ever asked unsuccessful and successful companies for feedback? Well, 30% no, but I plan to. Only a few percent no, and I'm not likely part to, but 22%, it's part of my normal engagements with industry. That is excellent. And then from time to time, I have done so. And the industry side mirrors this pretty well, except there's a much higher percentage, and I'm not sure, about 50%. Well, if you're not sure, then they're not reaching out to you. Then we'll shift that into another bucket. But those were the results from that poll question. So I'll go ahead and share those and then take them down and kick it back to you.
All right. Well, I think we're just about time for final thoughts. Sharon, let's start with you. Do you have any final thoughts to share with the audience in a second?
Yeah, I just want to say the advisory down select as well as the on-the-spot consensus were the two that were extremely, extremely helpful in helping us to move as fast as we did. And I will say organization is the key here. I mean, we rehearsed oral presentations. We didn't just get on screen. We decided what our names were going to be on the screen, whose screen was going to be, whose camera was going to be on, what the legal teams, instead of putting their name, they just put legal. And we had legal to vet the questions. And so it was a lot of rehearse. It was
all right.
A lot of,
say
again.
Well, let's move on to Monique.
Okay.
In just 10 seconds, what
I think we could call this a success because we were given the opportunity to utilize both the traditional FAR techniques and also the innovative techniques. We were able to use all the tools available in our back pocket and had the support of the leadership, legal, and everybody from DHS to you guys at PIL, and the dedication of our Queen Sharon and the cores who work, weekends and late at night. Without everyone's support, this could not have been awarded in 79 days.
This team worked so well together. They didn't do anything half-assed. They did everything fantastic. And I think the teamwork that they brought here is really what made this a successful project, as well as the innovations that they applied, because they knew failure was not an option here. They needed to help the American public, and they did. So Sharon, Monique, thank you very much for being with us here today. This has been great. I'm going to kick it over to Trevor to talk about if people have any questions.
If people do have any questions, then you can email pil@hq.dhs.gov. Also, if you need more slides, email that. We'll send you the slides back out. But each picture in here has a link to our 52-minute virtual boot camp, our PIL casts, which are a less than 10-minute bite-sized video training, our PIL boot camp workbook, our 2020 yearbook, sharing all of our great results from fiscal year 20, and also the solicitation from this COVID vaccination campaign. And please feel free to answer the question that popped up. Please rate this webinar on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best.
I want to thank everyone for being here today, especially Sharon, for Monique, for Bobby. Great webinar. Take a look at the other e-learning options that are coming up through NCMA. And of course, stick around for their other, the rest of their GCMS conference starting tomorrow. Everyone have a great day.